They said I was bipolar, that I had a chemical imbalance, that I would need medication for the rest of my life. But what if none of that was even true? What if, I wasn't even mentally ill, that I was just in pain? Why is it that during the time that I was on medication, that was when my life was the biggest mess and I was the most lonely and the hardest time connecting with anyone? I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder after going through trauma that I didn't quite have the right words for, such as being assaulted at a young age. It really cracked something open in me that nobody really even asked about exactly what happened. They just asked how I was feeling. And because I was so overwhelmed and dissociated and stuck in survival mode, these feelings were really quickly translated to symptoms. I didn't need a diagnosis when I was younger. I needed safety. I needed someone to help me process what I had gone through. Instead, I was told that my brain was broken, that I had a disorder, that I had a chemical imbalance. I would never be okay without medication. So I did what I was told for a couple years, and I spent most of my upper teens and younger 20s trying to stay compliant by taking the meds and doing some therapy and just trying to feel normal again. But instead, I was completely disconnected, not stable, just honestly silenced. And when I said that the meds weren't helping, they told me that it was the disorder talking. And when I still didn't get better, then you're called treatment resistant. If the meds aren't making you feel better, that's not you being treatment resistant. It's just honestly you probably grieving or, going through those feelings of being hurt and just being human. And no one ever taught me or most people how to move through that. Over the last few years, I've been studying psychology at a university level, and the deeper I went, the more disturbed I have become. Because so much of what we call mental illness today isn't actually grounded in truth. It's actually grounded in a diagnostic label, many of which come from, the DSM-5, which is a manual that looks scientific on the surface. And I always really did think it was scientific and based on fact. You would assume so since they teach it, but it's really just built on subjective checklists voted by committees, and there are no brain scans, no blood tests, just human suffering translated into codes. Higher diagnoses are, decided by how many boxes you check, not by what actually happened to you. It's not even based in biology. It's simply classification. System doesn't ask what your pain means. It just asks how to label it. And that's what this video is going to be about, because if you've ever been told that your brain makes you defective, this might be hopefully a turning point to make you question and be a turning point to take the time to debunk a lot of myths when it comes to psychiatry. I didn't enter the mental health system because I thought I had a disorder when I was younger. I entered because I was in pain, real unprocessed life-altering pain from some traumatic situations. And instead of being met with that with curiosity, it was more like being met with a clipboard where I had survived something traumatic. When you're younger, you don't really know how to articulate that well. You don't even have the language for what you go through. I just knew that something inside me felt so fractured and I wasn't okay, and I couldn't explain exactly why. When I was younger, I started doing self-harm and things like that. And we're in a world where when somebody sees someone acting out in those types of ways, the first thing that they get told is that they need to go see a psychologist or go see a psychiatrist, and most likely probably get put on some meds. When I began to feel anxious, moody, and disconnected and emotionally overwhelmed, I did what we were told to do growing up, asking for help. And instead of being guided through what happened to me and that it was okay to be hurt, I was told that help would come in the form of a diagnosis or continuing treatment forever. You have bipolar disorder. That moment doesn't leave you. There's something really profoundly disorienting about sitting in a sterile office while someone across from you with a checklist sits across from you all calm, telling you, you have a lifelong mental illness, you need treatment and probably medication forever. And in my case, the diagnosis was bipolar disorder and adjustment disorder. And once I was given those labels, everything I feel like started to have like a clinical explanation instead of a human explanation. And that explanation quickly became what feels like a prison, and I'm sure I'm not the only one that has felt that way. It told me that I couldn't even trust my own brain when I already didn't trust the world. That my sadness wasn't actually grief, and that my panic wasn't fear, and my dissociation wasn't protection. Instead, these were all framed as signs and symptoms of my malfunctioning mind and something chemically off with me. And when you're young and scared, you will really internalize that and begin to believe that the very ways that your brain tries to survive trauma were just symptoms of a defective brain. And people don't understand how much those labels and being told that, definitely during your developmental years, will alter your life forever. One of the first things I was told, and I'm sure others too, that I've touched on a little before, was that I had a chemical imbalance. Your serotonin is off, or your dopamine is misfiring, and this is why you may feel the way you feel, right? And it sounds scientific and maybe even a little reassuring, because in a way it kind of takes it off of you. But what I've come to understand after years of studying this whole field and going through the motions of being on meds and off meds and working through trauma is that that theory was never scientifically proven. Even leading psychiatrists even admit that the chemical imbalance idea was never backed by hard data. It was a marketing narrative crafted and heavily influenced by the pharmaceutical companies in the 1990s. It was a really easy story to tell. All you have to do is fix your brain chemistry, right? Well, it was more based in branding than truth. And one of the most sobering wake-up calls for me is when I read a quote from, I think it was Dr. Thomas Insel or something. He was the former director of the National Institute of Mental Health. And after decades of leading psychiatric research in the US, he said publicly, quote, "I don't think we moved the needle on a suicide or serious mental illness. I hold myself accountable." Now, I really thought about that because as someone who always wanted to go into psychology, I went to school to, become a licensed therapist, learning that a lot of this isn't even based on real merit and fact has uprooted so much of the things that I always thought I wanted to do and held to be, just solid truths. Billions of dollars of fundings, so many people medicated, and the outcomes? Look around, they haven't improved. The things that they promised, like healing and long-term stability, never materialized. It's definitely not materialized today, and it doesn't take a brain surgeon to look all around us and see that mental health has gotten worse over the years, not better, even though mental health resources have expanded. Looking back, what I was experiencing wasn't random biochemistry malfunction. It was just pain. It was trauma. It was my body and specifically my nervous system doing exactly what it's designed to do when something overwhelming happens, which is to dissociate and isolate and, between numbness and panic. But modern psychiatry doesn't have a language for that. To me, one way I could sum up an issue is that it doesn't ask what happened to you, it asks what's wrong with you. And if your answer includes too many tears, they'll call it depression, or if your energy fluctuates during that meeting, they'll call it bipolar, or if your body or how you're acting and you're stuck in a fight or flight, they'll typically tell you that you have a generalized anxiety disorder. It's a system that labels survival responses as pathology. And once you receive that label, everything that you experience afterward gets filtered through it. Your identity becomes so clinical and your healing is pharmaceutical. Now here's where things start to shift, not just in treatment plan, but in how you kind of begin to see yourself. Because when you're diagnosed with a mental illness, especially as a teenager or a young adult, when your frontal lobe is still developing, and that's a scientific fact, you don't just receive a label, you absorb it. And you start to imagine your entire future through only its lens. And you begin to wonder, maybe I'll never be stable. Maybe this is just who I am. And the system doesn't just let that belief, you know, sit in the background. It reinforces it. And it's unfortunate that humans go through pain, but that's okay. But instead of acknowledging that, you just become a patient. And I want to be clear that not everyone who ends up in the mental health system ends up on medication or even in a hospital or even heavily pathologized. But it's a lot more common than people realize, and a lot more common that makes me comfortable, where I feel like making videos like this is really important. When a teenager experiences emotional trauma or emotional abuse or physical abuse and they start experiencing panic attacks, they're overwhelmed. Maybe they talk to a school counselor and maybe they notice cuts on their arm, or they've lost weight, or they go to urgent care about it. And within 15 minutes, you're diagnosed with anxiety disorder and the whole cycle begins. You can be told that you have type 2 bipolar, which is another lifelong diagnosis. A big critique of mine is what often is missing is the most basic support. No one is teaching these young adults how to grieve, and I can say that because I wasn't taught that. And no one teaches you how to feel your feelings without fear of them, or learn how to regulate your nervous system and create safety inside their body again. Instead, they're taught that their distress is possibly a permanent disorder and not a natural human response to pain. Earning a psychology degree changed everything for me, like I said before, because it didn't just teach me theory, it exposed the cracks in the system that I once looked up to completely. We don't understand nearly enough about the human brain, and most of psychiatry is based on assumptions. You know, I've studied neuroplasticity, which is the brain's incredible ability to rewire itself over time, and diving into polyvagal theory, which it kind of explains how trauma affects our nervous system into survival mode, and how healing requires more than just a pill. It requires safety and regulation, and most importantly, human connection, which is extremely difficult to feel when you're numbed out from medication. I read a study once showing that long-term recovery is often more sustainable through therapy such as community and relationships and talk therapy, but not through pharmaceuticals. And now I've really gone back and questioned everything, including what my future career is going to look like and what I want it to look like. Because the current model of mental health care doesn't ask what happened to you, which is kind of what I said before. It takes trauma and turns it into symptoms, and it turns grief and turns it into a mood disorder. And it takes normal human response to unnormal events and medicalizes them. It's so frustrating. And at first, maybe that might seem compassionate. After all, getting a name for your pain can sometimes feel like a sense of relief. I do understand that, because it does validate that you're feeling the way you're feeling. But over time, it just locks you into a story that is just gonna keep repeating. And you know, that story is that they're mentally ill and that they're inherently unstable and that their emotions are dangerous. And the worst of all, it really teaches people to fear their own mind. And I'm not here to tell anybody what they should do with their treatment. That's not the point of this video. And I'm not here to shame anyone who have found relief through medication either, through psychiatry. But I am here to say something that changed my life. Maybe you're not mentally ill. Maybe you're just hurting. And maybe the system that was supposed to help is actually keeping you from remembering who you are. So after diagnosis, you know, treatment typically begins, and at first it does feel like help, because typically you're attending weekly therapy appointments, you're starting a new medication, and you're getting check-ins from professionals, and you're being told that you're being cared for and that you are taking the right steps. But over time, things will suddenly begin to shift, because the more help you receive, honestly, the lonelier you feel. That stage in your life, this is when we should be learning how to form adult relationships, like romantic bonds, and chosen family, like a tribe. But instead of all of your emotional needs are being met inside of a clinical setting, you'll never develop the muscles for reciprocal, like, mutual connection. And it actually kind of makes me think of the interview that Mark Zuckerberg gave not long ago. I can't remember who it was he was talking with, but it was about how AI and how people can use AI bots for companionship nowadays, and how they can meet their needs that way. And of course, he tried making that sound better by saying like, oh, that works for people who just haven't yet found the friends. And it's just something they can use as a tool in the meantime. But the issue with that is that if you have this clinical, cold, checklist type connection that's taking up your time and what you think is fulfilling that need, you're not actually going to go out and search for the real thing and pursue it. Instead of being held by people who love you, you're being observed, which is really creepy actually. And instead of being witnessed by friends, you're being evaluated by professionals and robots. The memories that still shake your nervous system aren't being shared with people who've earned your trust through real life experience. They're being shared with someone who is being paid to listen, or listening because they get data out of you. Or sure, sharing things to a clinical professional and an AI bot might feel safer because they can't technically judge you, but eventually it'll just feel like a substitution without any real depth. They become your surrogate friends, and AI and all of that become like your surrogate community. And you know, you're in there telling your trauma over and over again, and it stops being a chapter in your life and starts feeling like your entire identity. And I do want to be careful here, because therapy, when used with skill and intention, can be really powerful, and it can give you the language for your experiences and actually rewire ingrained patterns in your mind and reconnect with kind of like your sense of agency. But unfortunately, that's not what most therapy is. Most therapy today isn't really designed to help you recover and regain your independence. It's regained to keep you coming back. And I feel like most people I know who have entered the mental health system and have therapists, they go from therapist to therapist. And you know, I think if it works, then why are they still in this loop? The system doesn't profit when you actually heal and walk away. It profits when it makes you believe that you'll always need help. And the more trauma you've endured, the more vulnerable, unfortunately, you are to that messaging. And the longer you're immersed in that system, the more it begins to rewire your beliefs about other people as well. I've heard it over and over again. My friends don't understand mental illness. I need a professional. And on the surface, that might sound wise, but it's often, you know, it's underneath that is what you really mean is that I don't trust regular human beings with my pain anymore. And that's not mental health, that's isolation, polished and repackaged as care. And it honestly makes me a little emotional about this, because it really does hurt so many people's lives. And I saw this dynamic so clearly with one of my closest, most beautiful best friends that I've made since moving here to Arizona. And she's really opened up to me about her journey, and we've been able to have a deep bond about some similar traumas that we've been through. But she's gone through so much deep trauma that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy, and no one should have to endure. And she's also a mother, and she has spent years on a cocktail of psychiatric medication and cycling through diagnoses like bipolar and borderline personality disorder, BPD. But you know, eventually something inside of her has been stirring, and she even told her therapist about this, and told her therapist she wanted to stop the meds, and even an ex-partner of hers that she wanted to stop the meds. And it's not that she wanted to stop them recklessly or impulsively. She was talking about it and with intention and giving reasons for it, which is that she wanted to feel again. She wants to remember who she was. But instead of support, it seems like most people met her with fear. Like her therapist was telling her that she's gonna have a huge manic episode, and that it was dangerous and that she'd unravel. But you wanna know what actually happened? Yes, she cried, she grieved, she spent years numbing, and that's not because she was numbing, that's because she was finally processing. And through that process, her spark has been reappearing, and it makes me so happy to see, and it makes me so happy to have a friend that, you know, we can actually break down and cry together, where you're actually like, you're shaking and you can barely get the words out. And unfortunately, there's such a lonely epidemic, and I know a lot of us don't have those people, you know, to be able to do that, but it is the most important part of life. You have to put effort into your relationships, and honestly give people a chance to show up for you, because you don't know until you actually give them the chance to support you. Anyways, you know, My friend, after she got off her meds, she started to remember parts of herself that were, you know, forgotten, like her creativity and her joy and curiosity. And I remember one morning she was texting me because she was so happy that she watched one of her favorite old movies with her son one night, like 3 times in a row, and how it was the best time, and how she's been able to be so much more present with her kids and show up in ways that medication had long dulled. And you know, that crash that they warned her about, it never came. Yes, there's tears, but no manic crash. What happened is she's finally feeling human again, and I'm so happy and so proud of her. That's what so many people miss when we talk about support. We live in a culture where we now pay people to listen to us, and they're being, you know, they're being paid. They don't actually have to listen, and that's the not same thing as being loved and choosing to sit with your pain and witness your humanity, not because they're licensed to do so, but because they want to. And all this emotional processing happens in an emotional setting. It really teaches you to over-narrate your life. And it's like a language of diagnosis, and you forget to just be a freaking person. You know, you forget that it's okay to be messy and emotional and irrational sometimes, and even contradictory, and you're still deserving of love. And whether you're religious or not, you know, but for me, God knows that we're not perfect. That's part of being human. That's why we're on earth and not heaven. And yeah, we're gonna have messy parts, but all those messy parts are deserving of love. You know, whatever higher power you believe in or don't believe in, you deserve love. Real healing for you isn't gonna look scheduled, and it's most definitely not gonna be billable. You know, sometimes it honestly just looks like crying in your best friend's kitchen while she makes you tea, or lying in the grass and finally breathing. Because humans, we are tribal cultures, and we are meant to coagulate. I think I said that right. And we're meant to heal in relationships. And by making everything so clinical, we have been losing that, and it's scary. We're being taught that our emotions are dangerous and conditioned to believe that tears are clinical and panic is pathological, and anything outside of stable is a liability. And that belief system has created generations of people who have confused treatment with connection. A big trap that a lot of people don't see is that when you feel safe in therapy, you end up needing more therapy. It's addicting. And you only feel validated when you're sick. You know, part of your subconscious will stay sick just so that you keep getting that feeling of being seen. And I know I've talked about patterns on my channel before, and people who have gone through trauma and given a diagnosis are told that they're emotionally unstable. Those people tend to be the people stuck in these perpetuating cycles where they're honestly messing up their own lives a little bit over and over, you know, subconsciously. It's not like you're doing it on purpose and that you're being manipulative. I'm not accusing anyone of being manipulative. I went through those cycles of self-destruction and ruining things when things were good. It's survival, but it's such a trap because you were never meant to be someone's client forever. You were meant to live. So I think we need a different definition of help. Not pills, no more diagnostic codes. I think the whole entire field needs to be changed to emphasize people, community, and freaking dignity. You know, the next time someone cries in front of you, try this. Don't ask what medication they're on. Don't try to pathologize their emotions. And don't assume they're broken. Just say, that might be the act of real healing that you've experienced in years. Because I promise you, hearing that from someone, or, you know, even just being able to be that person for someone will bring so much more substance into your life. It certainly has for me. Okay, so another thing I wanted to touch on this video as well is the myth of the chemical imbalance that I thought was the holy truth for so long, and so many people still do. For years, the dominant healthcare narrative is that that was true, and it is seductive because you're not sad, you're sick, your depression, anxiety, those aren't responses to your life. They're framed as a biological flaw, a chemical imbalance, something hardwired and even genetic, and most importantly, permanent. You don't need to feel or process your pain, you just need a prescription. This message has been everywhere for years, and it still is today, obviously, like in ads and TV and, you know, doctors' offices. But it was never actually proven though. It was just repeated, and And trust me, it's blown my mind to actually go back and fact check all of this that I thought was gospel, you know, because in reality, the chemical imbalance theory was never scientifically confirmed. Even leading figures in psychiatry have admitted this. Like, I think his name was Ronald Pies or something. I'm not really sure how to pronounce his name, but I do know that he was the former editor-in-chief of Psychiatric Times, openly stated that the theory was more of a useful metaphor than a scientific fact, a metaphor that spread like freaking wildfire. And by the time that that admission has come, it's too late. The idea has already taken root, and the psychiatric field has grown immensely, and now it's rooted in public consciousness. Once you get someone to believe that their brain is broken, people will stop asking deeper questions, and they tend to stop looking inward for answers. And you start to see any pain that you're feeling not only as just like not meaningful, you just see it as something to push through and, you know, shove away, and you just see it as something to manage. And that belief is extremely profitable, and obviously not in a good way, because if your disorder is permanent, then your treatment has to be permanent too, right? Oh, sorry. It's all just a business model, not a care model, let's be real. It's not designed to help you heal and move on, but to keep you enrolled. And this isn't me trying to talk all conspiracy, it's really not, it's just economics. The psychiatric industry generates billions and billions of dollars by convincing people that lifelong dependency is a normal part of recovery. And how it typically plays out, you start medication, maybe it helps for a while, maybe you start to feel a little numb, and then the side effects creep in, and then eventually it just stops working the way you were promised. And instead of your provider asking, maybe this is the wrong approach, the narrative really just becomes, you're treatment resistant, or like I said, just get put on new meds. And it's so upsetting because so many people have trusted the experts who have followed directives and altered their brain chemistry willingly. And when it doesn't work, you know, and they let their doctors know, the doctors don't question the treatment, they question you. And it's such an upsetting feeling. It's not science, it's gaslighting. Institutionalized and medicalized gaslighting. And I know I get a little passionate about this, but you know, I've spent the last few years immersed in psychology, like I said, and I didn't want to go into this field to pathologize people. I wanted to understand pain and get to the root. But so much of what I've taught is reductionist and disconnected and really just pharmaceutical orientation. Entire textbooks still cite the chemical imbalance myth, even though it's been debunked. Most diagnostic criteria barely mention trauma, let alone understand the complexity. And of course, yes, we went over PTSD and CPTSD, but it reduces people's life experiences to clusters and treatment plans. And even the most well-meaning professors often don't question the training that they're taught to uphold because they were trained in it too. And the deeper I've gone, the more disillusioned I've become, because the more I've learned, the less I trust the system, you know? And we use these like clinical terms so casually now all the time, and it just is so frustrating. Or even if you're dissociated, you know, in the morning, sometimes we all are, or you're dissociated for even sadly a few months after a serious abuse, you're told you have a personality disorder. You're not disordered, you're just an awake human. What if your pain isn't a flaw or a problem with chemistry? It's just a mirror that tells you that something needs to be acknowledged and confronted. I get so worked up talking about it, as you guys can tell, but you know, people like my friend, they're a danger to the system, not because they're unwell, but because they got well without them. No prescriptions, no shock therapy, no lifelong label, just presence, grief, faith or family or friends and community, and they return to themselves. And guess what? It worked. That's the real threat, because you can't monetize friendship. And if you tell your doctor that I've been off my meds for so long and I'm feeling great and doing better, your doctor will literally not trust you when you say that and be almost disappointed and concerned. You can't prescribe trust, and when you realize that the most powerful tools are free, the illusions will start to crack. The system, I hope, will begin to lose some control. If you've been struggling and, you know, felt like you're the problem, I really want you to hear me clearly. You are not defective. You are not treatment resistant. You are not your diagnosis. You are a human being responding to life and sadly maybe some unfortunate situations. Your body, your brain, your emotions are trying to tell you something important. We don't need more suppression. We need more permission to feel, and you need to create an urgency for yourself to make connections with other people around you. I honestly believe most people were never broken. It's just the system is. And of course, you know, every single situation is nuanced, but I truly believe that. Sometimes we forget that crying is healthy, and grief really is human. It sucks, but being overwhelmed is just your nervous system responding directly to things that, yeah, were never supposed to happen to you. And, you know, even now I know my nervous system is a little sensitive. I feel everything really intensely. Like, I can always sense tension in the room. I'll literally feel the heartbreak of strangers like it's my own, and I used to think that that was a problem, but now I understand that it just means I'm alive, and it's one of my strengths, and the fact that I haven't gone numb, which is a blessing. And that's something that psychiatry never taught me. It taught me to fear it. It taught me to try to just stabilize instantly instead of feeling. Pretty much what I'm saying is that for my own healing and watching, you know, friends of mine return to themselves, is that avoiding pain doesn't lead to joy. You don't rediscover your spark by dulling everything down. You find it by letting yourself feel again. Even though, yes, it's freaking terrifying, and then no, it's not gonna be easy, and it might be messy, but it's real, and it's your real life to live. So what happens when you do start to actually heal? Fog lifts and you start to trust your instincts again. I encourage you to dissect and like research on your free time, and I don't think that you'll see it the same, you know, once you see behind the curtain, because I know that's what happened to me. Here's the truth. If the drugs work, the drugs get the credit. But if they don't work, then you're told you're the problem. And a lot of the research I'm doing, there are a lot of weird other solutions that they're offering, which is where they're literally entering like electrodes in their mind, or pushing transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is pretty much just more rounds of electroshock because the pills didn't work. And this isn't, like I said, me spinning conspiracy theories. I'm not making this up. If you think that those types of extreme treatments are rare, they're growing industries right now. Medical device industries are investing heavily in these next wave inventions, not because they're helpful for the patient, but because they're very profitable. The drug market may sound saturated, but the tech side of psychiatry, that's just getting started, and it's terrifying. Not enough psychiatrists start out with telling you, you know, go outside, feel the sun, take your shoes off, walk in the grass. How about try sitting and having a real conversation with a friend and cry and pray and grieve? Hold your child, hold your niece and nephew. I don't remember any friends of mine ever telling me that that's what they told them to do, but those are the things that actually help me heal. And real healing isn't about becoming perfect. You know, no one's ever going to be perfect. There's no such thing. That's why you often don't hear stories like mine or my friends, because we just didn't recover. We walked away. We saw behind the curtain and we lived to tell the truth. And the truth is, there is nothing wrong with that healing. Feel daunting, like you're never gonna get that spark back, but I promise you that spark inside of you is still there, no matter how many pills they might have given you. It might be buried, it might feel like it's just flickering, but it's not gone. So how did we even get here? How did we get to a point where people are told grief is a disease, where children are diagnosed before they can even form an identity? It didn't happen overnight. The system wasn't built all at once. It was built by industries and incentives and really replaced something real. Once upon a time, healing actually happened in tribes and families and kitchens and shared silence. If you were going through something hard, people sat with you, and you had elders to give you wisdom and your friends to give you presence, and you weren't expected to be better by next Tuesday to go to work or labeled defective for having a breakdown. But today, if you're in pain, where do you go? Not to your neighbor, not to your community. You go to a therapist, a psychiatrist, a program, or an AI bot. And sure, those things might help sometimes. I still think that talk therapy can be really helpful, but they also become our only option. Not because we chose it, but because we're being steered in this direction. And what I've seen is a field torn in two. One side really wants to genuinely help everybody. I'm not trying to say everybody in this field is evil and just wants to treat you like a checklist. But there is another part that serves like a machine, driven by pharmaceutical marketing and insurance reimbursement codes and expanding diagnostic criteria. It makes people forget that you're allowed to be unwell sometimes. You're allowed to question everything, cry in the shower, on the floor, feel hopeless, feel rage, and still be human. But that doesn't mean that you're broken. And when you grow up in a culture when no one has time to even sit with that, where parents are overworked, our screens are always on, Meals are rushed or brought to your door, and everything is so transactional. It makes sense that you end up in a psych ward before you ever have an actual conversation about your pain. The lie that the system sells, that you're too disordered to be truly held, and it creates a culture of dependency, not on drugs per se, but professionals and authority. It teaches us to look outward for answers instead of inward with love or a higher power if you believe in one. Everything that I'm touching on in this video, I know I tend to rant, but it's not just psychiatry that's the problem. It's everything around it, like the processed food that we eat, the screen time, the economic stress, and how it's just leading us more and more into isolation. And it's hard to heal when you're chronically inflamed and scrolling through curated images of other people's lives, and we haven't really been taught how to just simply be with ourselves. Most people can't even go on a walk in nature without having music or headphones or a podcast on. And what I'm trying to say in this whole video is that none of that is true. You are not too much and your pain is not pathological. There has been some stories that have made it to the media about people who've gotten off meds and reclaimed their lives, and you would think people would celebrate that, but major outlets don't. Like the New York Times and the Washington Post have published subtle but not so subtle hit pieces about these types of people, calling them dangerous and deceptive. And they don't know how to handle people that heal outside of the system. And this isn't because I don't believe in mental health and that it's important to talk about, because I really do, but because I do know about the issues in the system, I know that what we're doing isn't it. And I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm not a doctor, but I'm someone who's lived it and studied it and came out on the other side with some kind of clarity that I really want to share, and that I wish I had when I was 19 and searching for answers in a bottle with too many warning labels. What I want to say plainly and honestly, you are not broken, you're not defective, and any diagnosis that you got from mental health, I don't think it'll be lifelong. You're a human who has been overwhelmed in a world that gives us very few tools on how to actually deal with that. And you probably, unfortunately, did get, dealt, unfortunately, sometimes a shitty hand by people who are supposed to protect you. They didn't ask you what happened to you. They just wanted to put a label on it. Unfortunately, pain isn't always a problem to fix. I know we live in a quick fix culture where we want a solution right away, but sometimes it's our body's last honest signal that something needs attention. You're responding to things that hurt, and unfortunately, sometimes that does and will take years. And if no one ever gave you permission to do that, let me do that now. Whatever darkness you've been walking through, you do not need to carry shame on top of it. You do not need to pretend that coping is the same as healing. But stop outsourcing your intuition. Stop letting people profit off your pain. And remember that emotions are not illness, they are messengers. And if the system can't make sense of that, then the system is the problem, not you. If you're someone who started to taper off their meds or walked away from therapy and you're grieving the years, thinking you were sick, I see you and your story matters. And I want to invite anyone who made it this far in the video to share your story in the comments, or just with yourself in a journal. But if this video helped give words to something you've been feeling, please like and subscribe and share this with someone who could really benefit from it. Share it to people that you care about. Not because I need the algorithm, but because the more we speak out, the less power the system is gonna have over the people who suffer in silence. We really do deserve a better model, and we deserve to be understood as a whole. I believe truly healing begins when we stop trying to fix what was never broken and just remember who we really are. Thank you so much for being here. It means so much to me, and I'm sorry I tend to rant a lot, but I really hope that you guys got something out of this. All right, till next time, bye.